The diplomatic vessel Concord drifted through the neutral zone between human and Trilask space, its hull reflecting the distant stars like scattered diamonds. Ambassador David Reed sat in his quarters, reviewing holographic files that floated in the air before him. Each document detailed another failed attempt at peaceful contact with the Trilask Dominion. Border colonies had reported missing ships. Trade convoys had vanished without trace. And through it all, the Trilask had remained silent, watching from their fortress worlds. Reed rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of what tomorrow might bring. He was 53 years old, gray starting to show at his temples, and he carried the kind of tired wisdom that came from seeing both the best and worst of humanity. Before joining the diplomatic corps, he had served in the colonial defense forces during the Outer Rim conflicts. He understood violence intimately, which was precisely why he dedicated his life to preventing it. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. Commander Patricia Okonkwo entered without waiting for permission, a habit Reed had long since accepted. She was tall, muscular, with close-cropped hair and eyes that missed nothing. As head of his security detail, she had made her concerns about this mission abundantly clear. "Ambassador, I need you to reconsider the landing parameters," Okonkwo said, crossing her arms. "Meeting planetside on their territory with minimal security. Everything about this screams trap." Reed gestured to the empty chair across from his desk. Okonkwo remained standing. "The Trilask requested these specific terms," Reed explained. "They claim bringing armed forces to their homeworld would be seen as an insult, an act of aggression. And bringing an unarmed diplomat to a species known for conquering their neighbors through intimidation isn't." Okonkwo shook her head. "Sir, with respect, they've been expanding their territory for 200 years. Every species they've absorbed started with diplomatic talks that ended badly." Reed knew she was right. The files told that story clearly enough. The Rendali had sent negotiators. The Trilask had sent back demands. When the Rendali refused, 3 of their colony worlds were reduced to rubble. The pattern repeated with the Kethani, the Vorsh, and half a dozen smaller civilizations. Each time, the Trilask had offered the choice between submission and destruction. "The Galactic Assembly believes humanity might be different," Reed said quietly. "We're new to this region of space. We have no historical conflicts with the Trilask. Maybe that gives us a chance to reach them differently." "Or maybe it makes us look like easy prey," Okonkwo countered. She leaned forward, palms flat on his desk. "David, I've read the psychological profiles. The Trilask respect strength, only strength. They view diplomacy as something the weak do before they're conquered." Reed met her gaze steadily. "Then we show them that humanity can be both strong and willing to talk. That's why you and your team will be on standby the entire time. First sign of trouble, you pull us out." Okonkwo's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "The team is ready. Dr. Banks is running final checks on the translation equipment. Lieutenant Foster is reviewing Trilask military protocols. Roy Palmer is triple-checking every cultural custom we know about them." "Good," Reed stood, moving to the viewport. The planet Skardish was visible now, a dark world wrapped in heavy clouds. "How long until we enter orbit?" 4 hours. The Trilask have cleared a landing zone in their capital's diplomatic quarter. Okonkwo paused. "Sir, I'm authorized to scrub this mission if I determine the threat level is too high." Reed turned to face her. "I know, but we both know you won't unless there's immediate danger. Because despite your reservations, you understand what's at stake here. Humanity needs to establish itself as a legitimate power in this sector. If we run from every difficult negotiation, we might as well withdraw back to Earth and hide." "There's a difference between running from difficulty and walking into an ambush," Okonkwo said, but her voice had softened slightly. They had worked together for 6 years. She trusted his judgment, even when she disagreed with his choices. After she left, Reed returned to the viewport. His reflection stared back at him, ghostly against the backdrop of alien stars. He thought about his daughter, Emily, back on Earth. She had asked him why he kept taking dangerous assignments. He had told her that someone needed to be willing to take risks for peace, or humanity would never be anything more than another violent species clawing for territory. He hoped that answer would still make sense after tomorrow. The next morning, the landing party assembled in the shuttle bay. Dr. Howard Banks fussed with his portable analysis equipment, muttering about calibration issues. Lieutenant Amy Foster stood rigid in her dress uniform, her military bearing impossible to hide despite the diplomatic assignment. Roy Palmer, the youngest member of the team, kept glancing at his translation datapad as if the words might change. Reed addressed them calmly. "Remember, we're here to listen as much as to talk. The Trilask have agreed to discuss border territories and trade routes. That's more than they've offered anyone in decades. Whatever happens, we maintain composure and professionalism." The shuttle descended through Scardish's atmosphere. The clouds were thick, almost oily, and the air had a sulphurous tinge that made Banks wrinkle his nose. When they broke through the lower layer, the Trilask capital spread before them like a monument to conquest. Massive towers of black stone rose from the ground, each one carved with symbols that Palmer quietly identified as tallies of defeated enemies. Banners hung from the buildings, displaying Trilask military victories. The landing pad was surrounded by guards. The Trilask were imposing creatures, nearly 8 feet tall with scaled skin ranging from deep green to charcoal gray. Their eyes were yellow with vertical pupils, and their movements carried the fluid grace of natural predators. Each guard carried weapons that were ceremonial in appearance but clearly functional. As Reed's team descended the shuttle ramp, a Trilask commander approached. His scales were darker than the others, marked with scars that suggested extensive combat experience. He wore armor that gleamed like polished obsidian. "I am High Commander Drowman," the Trilask announced. His voice was deep, resonating in his chest like distant thunder. "You are the human envoy." Reed extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting, knowing the Trilask wouldn't reciprocate. "Ambassador David Reed, representing the United Terran Council, thank you for agreeing to these talks." Drowman's eyes tracked the movement of Reed's hand with predatory focus. "Your customs are strange. Come, the council chamber awaits." As they walked through the capital streets, Reed noticed civilians stopping to stare. Trilask citizens watched the humans with expressions that ranged from curiosity to contempt. Children pointed at them, and their parents pulled them close as if the humans carried disease. The council chamber was enormous, designed to make visitors feel small. Reed's team was led to a platform in the center of a circular room, while Trilask officials observed from elevated positions around them. It was theater, Reed realized. A performance designed to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. Drowman took his position at the highest point in the room. "So, humans, you wish to negotiate our borders. Tell me, what makes you believe you have anything to negotiate with?" Reed kept his voice level professional. "We seek mutual understanding. The United Terran Council controls 17 colony worlds in this sector. We have no desire for conflict, but we will defend our territories. A clear agreement benefits both our peoples." "Benefits?" Drowman leaned forward, and Reed could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. "You speak as if you have a choice in this matter." The negotiations had begun, but Reed felt the first whisper of warning in his gut. Okonkwo had been right to be concerned. This wasn't going to be a simple territorial discussion. The Trilask had something else in mind entirely. 3 hours into the negotiations, Reed felt the situation sliding beyond recovery. Drowman's questions had become increasingly pointed, focusing less on territorial boundaries and more on human military capabilities, ship production rates, and colony defense systems. Each question was wrapped in the language of diplomacy, but the intent was transparent. Dr. Banks had noticed it too. During a brief recess, he leaned close to Reed and whispered, "They're conducting reconnaissance. Every question is designed to assess our vulnerabilities." Lieutenant Foster kept her hand near her side arm, though they had all agreed to appear unarmed for these talks. Her fingers twitched nervously, and Reed could see the tension building in her shoulders. Roy Palmer continued translating, but his normally confident voice had developed a slight tremor. When negotiations resumed, Drowman's entire demeanor had shifted. The pretense of diplomatic courtesy vanished like smoke. He stood from his elevated position, his massive frame casting a shadow over the human delegation. "We have learned much today," Drowman announced. "Humanity is as we suspected, young, inexperienced, weak." Reed remained seated, projecting calm he didn't feel. "High Commander, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. We came here in good faith to discuss mutual borders, not to be assessed like specimens." Drowman's laughter boomed through the chamber, echoed by the other Trilesque officials. "Good faith? You came because you are desperate. Your colonies are exposed, scattered across systems you barely control. You seek negotiation because you lack the strength to enforce your own claims." "That's not accurate," Reed said firmly. "The United Terran Council maintains a substantial defensive fleet. We prefer diplomacy, but we're not incapable of defending ourselves." "Prefer?" Drowman descended from his platform, moving with that unsettling predatory grace. "You prefer diplomacy because you are soft. Your species evolved on a comfortable world, growing fat and complacent. You play at being galactic citizens, but you don't understand the fundamental truth of this region." He reached the human delegation's platform, towering over them. Reed stood slowly, maintaining eye contact despite the height difference. Around them, Trilesque guards had moved closer, forming a loose circle. "The truth is simple," Drowman continued. "Power matters. Territory belongs to those strong enough to hold it, and humans are not strong enough." Reed reached slowly into his jacket. Every Trilesque guard tensed, weapons coming up fractionally. He withdrew only a communication device, holding it where everyone could see. "High Commander, I'm going to contact my ship. This conversation has moved beyond productive negotiation. We'll be departing immediately." Drowman's hand shot out, faster than Reed could react, and crushed the communication device. The metal crumpled like paper in his grip. "You misunderstand your situation, Ambassador. You arrived to negotiate, but not for what you believed. This meeting was never about borders." Guards moved in swiftly. Foster reached for her weapon, but 3 Trilesque were on her before she could draw. Banks stumbled backward, tripping over his equipment. Palmer tried to run and was caught by his collar, lifted off the ground like a child. Reed remained still, calculating. His mind raced through scenarios, but they all ended the same way. 4 humans, surrounded by 24 armed guards on a hostile world. He had one option left. "Commander Okonkwo will come for us," Reed said quietly. "My security team knows our protocols. When we miss our check-in, they'll respond." "Let them try," Drowman replied. "Your single ship against our orbital defense grid. They would be destroyed before reaching the atmosphere." He gestured, and guards forced Reed's team to their knees. "But they won't try. Humans are too cautious, too afraid of escalation. You'll negotiate our terms, or your people will receive pieces of their precious ambassador." Reed's jaw tightened. He made one last attempt to trigger the emergency beacon sewn into his jacket lining, pressing the hidden button in a sequence Okonkwo had made him memorize. 3 short pulses, 2 long, 3 short. It would broadcast on frequencies the Trilesque might not monitor. It was a desperate hope, but the only one he had left. "Why?" Reed asked. "If you plan to take us hostage from the start, why go through the pretense of negotiation?" Drowman smiled, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Because we needed to understand humans, to see how you think, how you react, what you value. The Galactic Assembly speaks of your potential, your adaptability, your supposed compassion. We needed to know if you were a threat or simply another weak species ready for absorption. And what did you conclude? Reed kept his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. That you are soft metal pretending to be steel, Drowman said. You send one ship to negotiate. You arrive with minimal security. You request talks instead of taking what you want by force. Every choice reveals the same weakness. He leaned down until his face was level with Reed's. You will serve as an excellent message to your government. When they see what happens to human diplomats who overstep, they will learn their place in this sector. The guards dragged the 4 humans from the council chamber. They were separated in the corridors, each taken to different sections of the complex. Reed caught one last glimpse of Banks, the scientist's face pale with terror, before walls blocked his view. They threw Reed into a detention cell carved from the same black stone as the rest of the city. The walls were covered in scratches, marks left by previous prisoners. In the dim light, Reed could make out words in various languages, final messages from beings who had not survived Trilask hospitality. Hours passed in darkness. Reed used the time to memorize every detail of the cell, searching for weaknesses, possible escape routes. There were none. The Trilask had been imprisoning and interrogating captives for centuries. They knew their craft. When they came for him, it was night by the planet's cycle. 4 guards hauled him from the cell to a chamber that smelled of old blood and fear. Drowman waited there, along with several other Trilask who Reed hadn't seen before. Medical equipment lined the walls, but it was designed for torture rather than healing. Your government has been contacted, Drowman informed him. We've demanded they cede 3 of their colony worlds to Trilask control. They have 5 standard days to comply. Reed's heart sank. 3 colonies meant thousands of human lives displaced or enslaved. They won't agree to those terms. You're asking us to abandon our own people. Then we'll need to make our message more compelling, Drowman said. He nodded to the guards who strapped Reed into a medical chair. You see, Ambassador, we've studied human anatomy. We know exactly how much damage your species can endure before dying. We know which injuries heal and which leave permanent reminders. And we know that humans, with your excessive empathy, respond powerfully to the suffering of your own kind. Reed tried to remain calm, to access the training he'd received years ago for exactly this scenario. Focus on breathing. Don't give them satisfaction. Remember you're not alone. But those mantras felt hollow as the first tools were brought forward. Your crew will watch what we do to you, Drowman explained. Then we'll send you back to your ship as a demonstration. If your government is wise, they'll accept our terms. If not, we'll return the others to you piece by piece. Reed closed his eyes, thinking of Emily, of Okonkwo, of the crew waiting on the Concord. He thought of all the times he'd argued that civilization was stronger than barbarism, that diplomacy could solve problems violence couldn't. Then the pain began, and thinking became impossible. Commander Patricia Okonkwo stood in the bridge of the Concord, staring at the chronometer. Reed's check-in was 7 hours overdue. 7 hours of silence from the surface. 7 hours of her gut screaming that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Commander, we're receiving a transmission from the planet, the communications officer announced. It's from the Trilask government, directed specifically to you. Put it through. The view screen flickered and Drowman's face appeared. Behind him, Okonkwo could see a sterile room with medical equipment, and slumped in a chair, barely conscious, was David Reed. Okonkwo's hands clenched into fists. Reed's face was swollen beyond recognition. Burns covered his exposed skin. His hands were bent at unnatural angles, fingers clearly broken. Blood stained his torn diplomatic uniform. Commander Okonkwo, Drowman said pleasantly, I am returning your ambassador. Consider it a gesture of goodwill before formal negotiations begin. What have you done? Okonkwo's voice was dangerously quiet. We've begun teaching humanity its place in galactic affairs, Drowman replied. Your government will receive our formal demands within the hour. 3 colony worlds ceded to Trilask control. You have 5 standard days to comply. The ambassador's colleagues remain in our custody as insurance of your cooperation. The transmission ended before Okonkwo could respond. Minutes later, a Trilask shuttle departed from the surface, transmitting codes that identified it as carrying diplomatic cargo. It approached the Concord slowly, almost mockingly. Okonkwo ordered the medical bay prepared and headed down herself. When the shuttle docked and its hatch opened, the medical team rushed forward with a stretcher. What they lifted out barely resembled David Reed. Dr. Sarah Lynn took charge immediately, her team surrounding Reed with scanners and emergency equipment. Multiple fractures, second-degree burns across 40% of his body, possible internal injuries. Get him to surgery now. Okonkwo followed them to the medical bay, watching through the observation window as Lynn's team worked frantically. The ambassador she'd known, the man who'd argued for peace even when she'd counseled caution, was reduced to broken flesh, barely clinging to life. An hour into the surgery, Reed regained consciousness for brief moments. Lynn noticed and leaned close, trying to calm him, but Reed's lips moved, forcing words through the pain. "Commander," Lynn called through the intercom, "he's trying to tell you something." Okonkwo entered the surgical bay, moving to Reed's side. His eyes, blackened and swollen, struggled to focus on her. "The others," Reed whispered. "Banks, Foster, Palmer still down there." "I know, we'll get them back." "No," Reed's hand, mangled as it was, reached for her arm. "Not negotiation, won't work. They'll kill them slowly, sending message to humanity." "David, save your strength. We'll figure this out." Reed's grip tightened with desperate strength. "Not soft, understand. Can't let them think we're soft." His voice cracked, pain overwhelming him. "Make them understand what humans really are." Lynn administered more sedatives, and Reed's consciousness faded. Okonkwo stood there, looking at what the Trilask had done to a man whose only crime was believing in peace. She returned to the bridge with ice in her veins. Captain Raymond Ellis met her at the door. He was 58, a career officer who'd commanded exploration vessels for decades. He'd never wanted violence, had chosen exploration specifically to avoid it. But looking at Okonkwo's face, he knew those days were ending. "The transmission from Trilask High Command just arrived," Ellis said. "They want 3 colonies. Demand we abandon 15,000 colonists to their control. If we refuse, they'll execute our people on the surface." "They've already sent their message," Okonkwo replied. "Reed was just the first part." Ellis pulled up the medical reports on his screen. His jaw tightened as he read the extent of Reed's injuries. "The Galactic Assembly is requesting we file a formal complaint through diplomatic channels. They're suggesting a peacekeeping force be dispatched to mediate." "Mediate?" Okonkwo's voice dripped with contempt. "The Trilask tortured our ambassador and are holding 3 more hostages. What exactly is there to mediate?" "The Assembly wants to avoid escalation. Several member species have lodged complaints about human military buildup in this sector. They're concerned we might overreact." Okonkwo stepped closer to Ellis, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Overreact? Captain, I need you to understand something. I've read the reports on every species the Trilask have subjugated. Each one followed the Assembly's advice, filed complaints, waited for mediation, accepted promises of peacekeeping forces that never arrived, and each one ended up conquered or scattered." Ellis met her gaze. "What are you suggesting, Commander?" "I'm suggesting that we contact Earth Defense Command directly. No Assembly approval, no diplomatic delays. We tell them what happened to Reed, show them the state he's in, and let them decide how humanity responds." "That could start a war." "No, Captain. The Trilask started this war when they invited us to negotiate and then broke our ambassador. Okonkwo pulled up images from Reed's medical scan. These injuries weren't accidental. This wasn't interrogation gone wrong. This was systematic torture designed to terrorize us into submission, and they're broadcasting it to make an example of humanity. Ellis stared at the images for a long moment. He thought about his career, about the principles he'd upheld for 30 years. Then he thought about Reed, broken and dying in their medical bay, about Banks, Foster, and Palmer, probably enduring similar treatment at that very moment. "Send the message to Fleet Command," Ellis said quietly. "Full report, medical records, everything. Market priority Alpha. And Commander, prepare your security teams. If Fleet Command authorizes a response, we'll need to be ready." Okonkwo allowed herself a grim smile. "My teams have been ready since the moment Reed missed his check-in." The transmission to Earth was encrypted with the highest-level security codes. It included footage from the medical bay, Reed's testimony, and complete documentation of the Trilask demands. Okonkwo added her own assessment, 3 words that she knew would change everything. Hostile contact confirmed. The message traveled through faster-than-light relay stations, passing through a dozen systems before reaching Earth. At Fleet Command, Admiral James Kowalski received the priority alert in the middle of a strategic planning session. He was 62, a veteran of the colonial wars, and he carried the kind of scars that came from making impossible decisions. He watched Reed's condition report twice, read Okonkwo's assessment 3 times. Then he pulled up tactical displays of the Trilask system, studying their defensive positions, fleet strength, and planetary infrastructure. His chief of staff, Captain Beverly Grant, stood beside him. "The Assembly is requesting we wait for their diplomatic resolution. They're convening an emergency session." "How long will that take?" Kowalski asked. "Minimum 2 weeks, possibly longer if the Trilask request delays." "We have 3 hostages who don't have 2 weeks." Kowalski enlarged the tactical display. "The Trilask think they're dealing with desperate amateurs. They think we'll negotiate because we're afraid of the cost of fighting." "Aren't we?" Grant asked quietly. Kowalski turned to face her. "Beverly, what do you know about human history before we reach the stars?" "I know we fought each other for thousands of years." "We did, brutally, repeatedly. We learned every lesson about warfare the hard way, paid for each one in blood. And somewhere along the way, we learned something else. We learned that there are moments when talking ends and action begins, when making an example of aggressors becomes necessary to prevent future aggression." He pulled up his command interface, fingers hovering over the authorization codes. "The Trilask made a mistake. They thought breaking one ambassador would break our will. They don't understand that we've already been broken and rebuilt 100 times in our own history. They don't know that we've learned how to be ruthless when we need to be." Grant understood what he was about to do. "Admiral, this will define how the galaxy sees humanity for generations." "Yes," Kowalski agreed. "And right now, the galaxy sees us as victims. After today, they'll see us as something else entirely." He entered the authorization codes. Across human space, in every major fleet anchorage, ships began receiving movement orders. Battle groups that had been on patrol status shifted to combat readiness. Supply vessels loaded ammunition and fuel at emergency rates. The order was simple: assemble at Skardish, prepare for hostile engagement. Kowalski opened a direct channel to the Concord. Okonkwo's face appeared on his screen. "Commander, this is Admiral Kowalski, Earth Defense Command. We've reviewed your report. A battle group is being dispatched to your location. Estimated arrival 36 hours. "Understood, Admiral. What are our rules of engagement?" Kowalski's expression was granite. "We're coming for our people, Commander. Everything else is negotiable until it isn't. Make sure the Trilask know we're coming. I want them to have time to think about their choices." Okonkwo smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. With pleasure, Admiral. High Commander Drowman reclined in his command chamber, savoring what he believed was inevitable victory. The humans had been silent for nearly 2 days since receiving his demands. He interpreted that silence as paralysis, as fear overwhelming their capacity to respond. Around him, his advisors discussed the logistics of occupying 3 human colonies, already planning which resources to strip first. The human fleet strength in this sector is minimal, his military coordinator reported. 1 diplomatic vessel, 3 patrol frigates, a handful of commercial ships. Even if they attempted resistance, our orbital platforms would destroy them within minutes. Drowman nodded, pleased. And the hostages? The 3 humans remain in detention. The doctor has developed an infection from his injuries, but is being kept alive. The female soldier continues to resist interrogation. The translator has become mostly compliant. Good. When the humans accept our terms, we'll return the bodies. If they refuse, we'll broadcast their executions across every human colony. Either way, humanity learns its place. A communications officer interrupted. High Commander, we're receiving a transmission from the human diplomatic vessel. Excellent, they're ready to negotiate surrender. Drowman gestured magnanimously. Display it. Commander Okonkwo's face appeared on the screen. Her expression was utterly calm, almost serene. That should have been Drowman's first warning. High Commander Drowman, this is Commander Patricia Okonkwo of the United Terran Council vessel Concord. I'm transmitting this message to inform you that a human fleet is currently en route to Skardish. Estimated arrival time is 22 hours. Drowman laughed. A fleet? Commander, your military capacity in this sector is thoroughly documented. You have nothing that could threaten our defenses. You're correct that our local forces are limited, Okonkwo replied, which is why the fleet is coming from Earth. 15 warships, including the dreadnought Vengeful Dawn under Admiral James Kowalski. They're coming for our people. I suggest you release them immediately. The confidence drained from Drowman's face. 15 warships was a significant force, more than they'd expected humans could mobilize so quickly. But his orbital defenses were strong, and his own fleet numbered 40 ships. A desperate bluff, Drowman said, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. If your fleet approaches this system, we'll execute your people and destroy any ships that enter our space. That's your choice to make, Okonkwo said. But I should inform you that Admiral Kowalski has authorized full combat operations. This isn't a rescue mission, High Commander. This is a response to an act of war. What happens next depends entirely on your actions. The transmission ended. Drowman stared at the blank screen, his mind racing. He turned to his military coordinator. Deploy the fleet to defensive positions, activate all orbital platforms, and increase security on the human prisoners. If this is real, we may need them as bargaining leverage. 22 hours later, the human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Trilask system. 15 ships, exactly as Okonkwo had promised. At their center was the Vengeful Dawn, a dreadnought-class vessel whose hull bristled with weapons. The Trilask response was immediate. 40 warships launched from orbital anchorages, moving to intercept. Planetary defense platforms powered up their main guns, targeting solutions already calculated. It was an overwhelming show of force, designed to make any attacker reconsider. Admiral Kowalski stood on the bridge of the Vengeful Dawn, studying the tactical displays. His fleet was outnumbered nearly 3-1. By conventional assessment, they were outgunned and outpositioned. But Kowalski hadn't survived 30 years of military service by following conventional thinking. Open a channel to the Trilask command, he ordered. Drowman's face appeared on screen, projected against the backdrop of stars and warships. Admiral, you're outnumbered and outmatched. Turn back now and we may allow your fleet to leave this system intact." "High Commander," Kowalski replied calmly, "I'm here for 3 human citizens you're holding hostage. Release them immediately and we'll withdraw." "Unacceptable. Your government will comply with our territorial demands or face the consequences." Kowalski nodded as if he'd expected that response. "Then let me clarify the situation. You tortured a human ambassador who came to you in good faith. You're holding 3 more humans as hostages. You've demanded we surrender 3 colonies containing 15,000 civilians. Do I have that correct?" "You do," Drowman said smugly. "And your choices are simple: comply or watch your people die." "I see." Kowalski turned to his tactical officer. "Lieutenant, transmit package Delta to all ships. Authorization code Kowalski Delta 77. Across the human fleet, vessels began moving in patterns that seemed defensive, almost passive. The Trilask fleet adjusted their formations, preparing to exploit what they perceived as hesitation. "High Commander, I'm going to give you one final opportunity," Kowalski said. "Release our people in the next 30 minutes, and we'll negotiate reparations through proper channels. Refuse, and I'll demonstrate why humanity has been studying warfare for 10,000 years, while you've been bullying civilizations that couldn't fight back." Drowman's scales flushed darker with anger. "Your threats are meaningless. You're outnumbered 3 to 1. Your primitive ships can't match our firepower." "Outnumbered isn't the same as outmatched," Kowalski replied. "But I suppose you'll need to learn that the hard way. Clock's running, High Commander. 29 minutes. The channel closed. Drowman turned to his fleet commander. "This is absurd posturing. Move to engagement range and prepare to fire. We'll destroy their flagship first and watch the rest scatter." The Trilask fleet advanced in standard formation, a wall of firepower designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers. They'd used these tactics for centuries, and they'd always worked. Why would humans be any different? They found out 18 minutes later. The human fleet suddenly dispersed, ships breaking formation in seemingly random directions. Trilask gunners struggled to acquire new targeting locks, confused by the chaotic movement. Then the humans struck. What followed wasn't a traditional space battle. The humans didn't engage in the broadside exchanges the Trilask expected. Instead, they demonstrated tactics born from centuries of human military evolution. Small craft launched from the larger ships, too numerous and too fast for the Trilask point defense systems. These fighters deployed electronic warfare packages that flooded Trilask sensors with phantom signals. In the confusion, human ships penetrated the Trilask formation from unexpected angles. Their weapons weren't the most powerful in the galaxy, but they were precise. Railgun volleys targeted engine clusters, disabling Trilask ships without destroying them. Missile strikes took out communication arrays, isolating ships from their command structure. The Trilask fleet commander ordered his ships to concentrate fire, but human electronic warfare made coordinated targeting nearly impossible. Ships fired at shadows while real threats slipped through their defenses. Within minutes, 5 Trilask warships were drifting, powerless. Within 30 minutes, half their fleet was combat ineffective. Drowman watched in horror from his command center as his military superiority evaporated. How are they doing this? "They're not fighting us ship to ship," his tactical officer explained, voice shaking. "They're fighting us as a system, disrupting our communications, blinding our sensors, attacking our coordination. Every ship we have is individually more powerful, but we can't use that power effectively." The remaining Trilask ships began retreating toward the planetary defense grid. Hopping the orbital platforms would turn the tide. But the humans had planned for that too. As Trilask ships fell back, human vessels established orbital superiority over key positions. Kowalski's voice cut through every communication channel on the planet. "High Commander Drowman, your fleet is disabled. Your orbital defenses are currently targeted by my ships. You have 2 choices: Release our people immediately, or I demonstrate what happens to planetary installations when humans stop being polite. Drowman's hands trembled as he gripped his command console. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. The humans were supposed to be weak, disorganized, easily intimidated. How had they turned his numerical advantage into a liability? The hostages, Drowman barked to his guards. Bring them to the communications center, now. But beneath the planet's surface, in the detention levels, something else was happening. Lieutenant Commander Robert Quinn and his team of human special forces had been on Scardish for 3 days, inserted during the chaos of Reed's return. They'd been mapping the complex, identifying guard patterns, waiting for their moment. The moment arrived when the orbital battle began, and every Trilesque eye turned skyward. Quinn's team moved through the detention facility like shadows, neutralizing guards with practiced efficiency. They found Dr. Banks first, weak from infection but conscious. Lieutenant Foster had a broken arm but could walk. Roy Palmer was in shock but mobile. "Can you move?" Quinn asked Banks. "I can barely stand," Banks admitted, "but I'm not staying in this place another second." Quinn's team had extraction routes planned. They moved through maintenance tunnels that their surveillance had revealed, avoiding main corridors where Trilesque security was still active. Above them, they could hear the rumble of weapons fire from the orbital battle, feel the vibrations of defensive platforms firing at human ships. They reached an emergency exit that led to the surface maintenance yards. Quinn checked his tactical display. The extraction shuttle would arrive in 3 minutes, landing in a clearing 200 meters from their position. "Move," Quinn ordered. "Stay low, stay together." They emerged into Scardish's night, the sky above lit by the flashes of the continuing battle. In the distance, they could see Trilesque forces scrambling, trying to respond to threats from orbit and on the ground simultaneously. The extraction shuttle dropped through the atmosphere, shields glowing from atmospheric friction. It landed hard, ramp already dropping. Quinn's team pushed the hostages up the shuttle ramp as weapons fire erupted around them. Trilesque guards had finally located their position, plasma bolts scorching the ground. Quinn returned fire with controlled bursts while his team secured the hostages inside. "Go, go, go," Quinn shouted, diving through the closing hatch as the shuttle lifted off. The craft climbed rapidly, its pilot threading through gaps in the orbital defense grid that human ships had deliberately created. Trilesque fighters tried to intercept, but human escorts engaged them, buying precious seconds for the extraction. Aboard the Vengeful Dawn, Admiral Kowalski received the confirmation he'd been waiting for. "Sir, Quinn's team reports successful extraction. All hostages recovered and en route." Kowalski allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. Then he opened the channel to Drowman again. The Trilesque commander's face was ashen, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. "High Commander, my forces have recovered our people. Your leverage is gone. Now we discuss terms." "Terms?" Drowman's voice cracked. "You've crippled my fleet, invaded my planet. What terms could you possibly offer?" "You misunderstand," Kowalski said coldly. "I'm not offering terms. I'm delivering them. First, you and every Trilesque official involved in the torture of Ambassador Reed will surrender to human custody. Second, the Trilesque Dominion will pay reparations to our people, amount to be determined. Third, human monitoring stations will be established in Trilesque space to ensure compliance." "That's unacceptable. The Galactic Assembly will never allow such occupation." "The Galactic Assembly had their chance to prevent this," Kowalski replied. "They chose diplomatic channels over action. We chose differently. And as for occupation, you're confused. We're not occupying your space. We're ensuring you never torture another diplomat from any species again." Drowman looked around his command center, seeing the fear in his officers' faces. His fleet was scattered, his defenses compromised, and human ships now controlled his planet's orbit. For the first time in his life, he was the one being dictated to. If I refuse, Kowalski's expression didn't change. Then I'll demonstrate exactly how much damage a human fleet can do when diplomacy fails. I've disabled your military assets. I can just as easily target your infrastructure, your communications, your government facilities. You wanted to teach humanity about power, High Commander. Consider this your lesson in return. The transmission ended. Drowman slumped in his chair, the weight of defeat crushing his pride. Around him, his advisors argued about resistance, about calling for reinforcements, about last stands. But Drowman knew those were the desperate fantasies of beings who couldn't accept reality. He'd broken a human ambassador expecting to break human will. Instead, he'd unleashed something far more dangerous, human resolve. Elsewhere in the galaxy, the Galactic Assembly convened in emergency session. Species from across known space watched broadcasts of the Trilesque engagement with growing unease. The humans, newcomers to galactic politics, had just dismantled a fleet 3 times their size in less than an hour. Ambassador Rena of the Rendali Collective stood to address the assembly. Her species had been subjugated by the Trilesque decades earlier, forced to accept humiliating terms after their negotiators were executed. The human response was disproportionate, one ambassador argued. They escalated a diplomatic incident into military action without assembly approval. Rena's response was sharp. The Trilesque didn't commit a diplomatic incident. They invited humans to negotiate in good faith, then tortured their ambassador. They held hostages and demanded territorial concessions. Tell me, what diplomatic resolution existed for that situation? Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Other species who had suffered under Trilesque aggression began speaking up, their long-suppressed grievances finally finding voice. Humanity did what we lacked the courage to do, Rena continued. They enforced consequences against an aggressor species that has brutalized this region for centuries. Perhaps instead of condemning them, we should be asking why the Assembly allowed the Trilesque to operate with impunity for so long. The debate raged for hours, but the underlying message was clear. The galaxy's power dynamics had shifted. Humanity wasn't just another species seeking accommodation. They were a force willing to act when others merely deliberated. Back on the Concord, Dr. Lin worked to save Dr. Banks from the infection that had ravaged his system during captivity. Lieutenant Foster's broken arm was set and healing. Roy Palmer underwent counseling for the psychological trauma of imprisonment and torture. All 3 would recover, physically at least. The mental scars would take longer. David Reed regained consciousness 5 days after the engagement ended. He woke in the medical bay, his body wrapped in regenerative bandages, pain medication keeping the worst at bay. Commander Okonkwo sat beside his bed, reading reports on a datapad. Patricia, Reed's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. She looked up, relief flooding her features. "Welcome back, Ambassador. You gave us quite a scare." Reed tried to smile, but his face wouldn't cooperate properly yet. The others recovered safe. Banks is 2 rooms over finishing his treatment. Foster and Palmer are back on their feet. Okonkwo paused. "We got them out, David, all of them." "How?" Reed asked. "I remember Drowman saying our fleet was insufficient, that we'd never dare attack." Admiral Kowalski disagreed with that assessment. Okonkwo pulled up tactical footage on her datapad, showing it to Reed. 15 ships, tactical superiority in 42 minutes. The Trilesque fleet is effectively destroyed. Reed watched the footage with mixed emotions. Relief that his people were safe. Sorrow that his hope for peaceful resolution had led to violence. And something else, something harder to name. "I wanted to prove we could talk our way through problems," Reed said quietly. "That humanity had evolved beyond solving everything with force." "We tried that," Okonkwo replied. "The Trilesque chose to interpret our willingness to talk as weakness. They made their decision. We made ours. And now the galaxy sees us as just another aggressive species. Okonkwo shook her head. No, David. Now the galaxy sees us as a species that tried diplomacy first but won't accept being victimized when diplomacy fails. There's a difference. We didn't start this, but we sure as hell finished it. Reed closed his eyes, exhausted. What happens now? Now you heal. The Trilask are complying with Kowalski's terms. Drowman and his co-conspirators are in human custody, awaiting trial. Reparations are being negotiated, and every species in this sector is reassessing their relationship with humanity. That's what I was afraid of, Reed murmured. Don't be, Okonkwo said firmly. You know what's been happening since the engagement. 4 different species have contacted us requesting defensive alliances. 6 more want to open trade negotiations. The Rendali Collective publicly thanked us for doing what the Assembly wouldn't. We're not feared, David. We're respected. Reed thought about that for a long moment. Respect earned through violence rather than virtue. It wasn't what he'd hoped for when he'd entered diplomatic service, but perhaps it was the reality of galactic politics. Species that preyed on the weak needed to understand there were consequences. And sometimes, being willing to enforce those consequences was the only language predators understood. The Galactic Assembly must be furious, Reed said. They're conflicted, Okonkwo admitted. Some condemn our actions, others quietly approve. But here's what matters. The Trilask have been expanding through intimidation for 2 centuries, and nobody stopped them. We did. In one engagement, we demonstrated that their tactics don't work on everyone. That might prevent future conflicts more effectively than a dozen diplomatic protests. Reed felt sleep pulling at him, the pain medication and exhaustion taking their toll. But before he drifted off, he asked one more question. Was it worth it? The cost, the violence, the precedent we've set? Okonkwo looked at him steadily. Ask Banks when his infection clears. Ask Foster about the interrogation she endured. Ask Palmer about the week he spent in that cell. Then ask yourself if letting them rot on that planet while we filed diplomatic protests would have been the moral choice. Reed didn't have an answer. Perhaps there wasn't one. Perhaps that was the burden of operating in a galaxy that respected strength over principle. You made the hard choices and lived with the consequences, hoping that someday those choices would lead to a better future. As sleep claimed him, Reed thought about the scars he'd carry for the rest of his life. Physical reminders of what happened when civilization met barbarism. He'd wanted to prove humanity had evolved beyond violence. Instead, he'd proven that humans understood when violence was the only language left to speak. Maybe that was its own kind of evolution. 2 months passed before David Reed stood in front of a mirror without flinching at his reflection. The medical teams had done remarkable work, but some scars ran too deep for even advanced treatment to erase completely. His hands would never have their full dexterity back. The burns on his torso had healed but left permanent discoloration, and his face, while recognizable, carried lines that hadn't been there before. He stood now in the observation deck of the human station Unity, orbiting the colony world of New Columbia. Below him, cargo ships moved between the station and the planet, carrying supplies and personnel. Life continued, as it always did, regardless of what happened to individual people. The door chimed. Reed turned to see Commander Okonkwo entering, carrying a sealed folder. Ambassador, the Galactic Assembly has requested your testimony regarding the Trilask incident. Reed smiled grimly. They're calling it an incident now. That's diplomatic. They're calling it whatever allows them to avoid taking a position, Okonkwo replied. She handed him the folder. They want a full account from you, Banks, Foster, and Palmer. They're particularly interested in whether you feel human response was proportional. Reed opened the folder, scanning the formal request. What they really want to know is whether they should condemn us or accept what we did as necessary. Probably, but your testimony will matter. You're the one who experienced Trilask hospitality firsthand. What you say carries weight. Reed closed the folder. Schedule it. I'll testify, but I won't apologize for surviving, and I won't condemn the people who saved my life. 3 days later, Reed found himself in a conference chamber that had been converted into a testimony venue. Representatives from 40 species watched via holographic projection as he detailed the events on Skardish. He spoke calmly, methodically, describing the false negotiations, the seizure of his delegation, and the systematic torture that followed. When he finished, an ambassador from a species he didn't recognize asked the question they'd all been waiting for. Ambassador Reed, do you believe the human military response was appropriate to the situation? Reed considered his answer carefully. The Trilask didn't make a diplomatic error. They invited us under false pretenses with the specific intent to brutalize human representatives as a message to our government. They demanded we surrender 3 colonies and 15,000 civilians. When faced with that situation, what would you consider an appropriate response? Diplomatic protest through proper channels, the ambassador suggested. We tried diplomacy, Reed replied. That's why I was there. The Trilask's response was to break my fingers one at a time while my colleagues watched. So tell me, how many fingers should I have lost before military response became acceptable? All of them. Should we have waited until they executed hostages, surrendered colonies to avoid conflict? The chamber fell silent. Reed continued, his voice harder now. I went to Skardish believing in the power of peaceful negotiation. I still believe in it. But I also learned that some species view willingness to negotiate as weakness to exploit. The Trilask have been expanding through intimidation for 2 centuries, and nobody stopped them because stopping them required force. Humanity chose differently. We enforced consequences against an aggressor who believed themselves immune to accountability. Another ambassador spoke up, this one from the Rendali Collective. Ambassador Reed, your injuries are clearly visible, yet you continue in diplomatic service. Why? Reed touched his face reflexively. Because someone needs to remember what happens when diplomacy fails. Someone needs to stand at these negotiations and remind everyone that words only matter if there's will behind them. The Trilask thought humans were soft because we preferred talking. They learned otherwise. Perhaps that lesson will prevent future incidents. The testimony continued for hours, but Reed's message was clear. Humanity had tried peace and been met with violence. The response that followed was consequence, not aggression. The assembly could condemn it or accept it, but the fundamental equation hadn't changed. Species that preyed on the weak needed to understand that some species would fight back. After the testimony concluded, Reed met with the other survivors. Dr. Banks looked healthier, the infection finally conquered. Lieutenant Foster's arm had healed, though she still favored it slightly. Roy Palmer remained quiet, still processing what had happened to them. How did it go? Banks asked. About as expected, Reed replied. Half the assembly thinks we're heroes, half thinks we're dangerous. Reality is probably somewhere in between. We're survivors, Foster said quietly. That's what matters. We survived because Kowalski didn't abandon us to diplomatic channels. Palmer spoke up, his voice still uncertain. Do you think it'll change anything? Will other species think twice about targeting humans now? Reed considered that question carefully. Some will, others won't. But at minimum, they'll understand that humanity doesn't accept victimization as the cost of galactic citizenship. That's a message worth sending. The weeks that followed brought unexpected developments. Several species that had been victims of Trilask aggression began requesting human assistance in renegotiating terms of their subjugation. The Assembly, faced with public support for humanity's actions, quietly scaled back their criticism, and most significantly, requests for human diplomatic services increased dramatically. The United Terran Council responded by creating a new position, ambassador at large for difficult negotiations. They offered it to David Reed. He accepted. His first assignment took him to a border dispute between two species that had been locked in conflict for decades. Both sides had hardened their positions, viewing compromise as weakness. Reed arrived at the negotiating table with visible scars and a reputation for surviving situations that killed others. The negotiations lasted 3 days. At one point, when discussions threatened to collapse, Reed simply stood and showed them his hands. These are what happens when negotiation is treated as theater rather than genuine effort, he said quietly. I came here because you both requested mediation. If either of you is here in bad faith, planning to use these talks as cover for other actions, leave now. Because if you waste our time, if you betray this process, you'll learn what humanity does to species who mistake our willingness to talk for inability to act. The negotiations succeeded. Both species signed agreements they could accept. Word spread quickly. The scarred human diplomat wasn't just a victim. He was a walking reminder that civilization had teeth when necessary. 6 months after the Trilesk incident, Admiral Kowalski requested a meeting with Reed. They met in a quiet restaurant on Earth, away from official channels and recording devices. I've been reading reports about your diplomatic successes, Kowalski said. 5 successful mediations in 6 months. That's impressive. The scars help, Reed admitted. Species look at me and understand that I know the cost of failed diplomacy. It makes them take the process more seriously. Kowalski nodded slowly. I've been asked to testify before the Assembly about the engagement. They want to understand human military doctrine, how we achieved tactical superiority against a numerically superior force. What will you tell them? The truth, that humanity has been fighting wars since before we had written language, that we've studied every form of conflict, from small unit tactics to strategic warfare, that we've learned lessons in blood over thousands of years, and those lessons make us formidable when we need to be. Kowalski paused. But I'll also tell them that we prefer not to fight, that our history of warfare taught us its true cost, which is why we try every alternative first. Reed raised his glass. To alternatives and the will to enforce them when they fail. They drank in silence. 2 men who understood that peace required both the desire to avoid conflict and the capacity to win it when necessary. Reed returned to his apartment that evening and stood again before the mirror. The scars were still there, still visible, still permanent, but he no longer saw them as markers of failure. They were reminders, evidence that he'd tried peace and paid the price for misjudging his opponents, but also evidence that he'd survived, that humanity had come for him, that species could be both civilized and deadly when circumstances required. The galaxy had asked humanity to negotiate. The Trilask had returned their envoy broken and mutilated, believing that would break human will. Instead, it had revealed something more fundamental about humans. They remembered, they learned, and they adapted. Ambassador David Reed would carry those scars for the rest of his life, a living testament to what happened when predators mistook humanity's preference for peace as inability to wage war. Every negotiation he conducted, every diplomatic success he achieved, was built on that foundation. The galaxy could choose cooperation or conflict. Either way, humanity had proven they could handle both. In the end, that was the real message the Trilask had sent when they returned Reed broken. They had shown the galaxy what humanity would endure for peace. And humanity's response had shown what they would inflict when peace was no longer possible. The lesson was clear. Humanity negotiated from strength, not weakness. And that strength came not from weapons or ships, but from the simple, terrible truth that humans understood violence intimately enough to avoid it whenever possible, and to execute it perfectly when necessary. That understanding would shape humanity's role in galactic affairs for generations to come, not as conquerors or victims, but as a species that preferred peace but would never accept subjugation, as a species that tried diplomacy first, second, and third, but kept weapons ready for when talking inevitably failed with those who only understood force. The Trilesc had asked humanity to negotiate. Humanity had agreed. And when the Trilesc returned their envoy broken, humanity taught the galaxy what happened next. Not revenge, but consequence. Not brutality, but justice. Not aggression, but the cold calculation of a species that knew exactly when talking ended and action began. That lesson would echo across the stars for centuries.